Today we're going to have our last big show of Settling the West unit. This one's on Native Americans of the Great Plains. And the focus of this big show is going to be the government response toward the Native Americans, or to the Native Americans, which was a policy of assimilation, which was to transform Native American culture to American culture. As you probably have some awareness, Native Americans of the Great Plains were nomadic tribesmen. They did not live in cities or towns or have the type of culture that the Americans had, who were settling in places like Iowa. And this brought them in conflict with Americans moving west. And so the government took a policy of assimilation to transform their culture. By 1850, most of the Native Americans lived west of the Mississippi River. That's because they had been east. There were Indians east of the Mississippi River, but they were pushed west. The Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1851 was set up to protect the territorial claims of various Indian nations, and what it really was designed to do was to allow Americans to pass safely through the Great Plains and get to the West Coast. And each Indian tribe was to be paid a yearly payment for 50 years. These were known as annuities, or a yearly payment. The U.S. Senate changed the compensation from 50 years to 10 years, but in point in fact, several tribes never received any payments, never were paid any of the annuities. But the United States did try to stop large-scale settlement into the Great Plains in 1851. And you can see, like with this map, large sections of the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming and Nebraska, and if it map went further down, of Colorado, were set aside for Indians. But the difference was, this was before discovery of gold. This was before other mining operations, and this was before the Homestead Act and the large-scale farming and frankly of cattle ranching of the Great Plains. That would come 15 to 20 years later, and this was in the beginning of the 1850s. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was set up to manage American Indian issues, and many felt like the reservation system was an important way for the government to deal with Native Americans. And the reservation system meant, as the name implies, to have a reservation, a spot, a hunk of land that Indians could live on and would be their land. It would relocating Indian tribes away from their ancestral homes, though, to land set aside by the United States government. But there's two problems with this. First of all, the goal was to force Indians to become farmers and to abandon their traditional way of life, being nomadic hunters of buffalo. And that's what this policy of assimilation is all about. Assimilation means to make that outside element like everybody else within the culture. But it took a radical change of the Indian culture. They couldn't be what they were before. The other thing was they were put on land that was very undesirable by the Americans. They didn't really want that land, but as we saw earlier, if gold or something was discovered on that land, they would again be moved off. As you might expect, many Indians of the Great Plains refused to live on reservations. They didn't want to live there. They didn't want to live away from where they had always lived, all their ancestors have lived. They wanted to stay where they were, and they wanted to be nomadic tribesmen. People like the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Sioux. Now, the United States' response to Indians not wanting to be assimilated into the American culture was to send 20,000 U.S. Army troops, many of them Civil War veterans, to confine the Indians to reservations, force them to be on the reservations. This served a couple purposes. First of all, what to do with all these soldiers after the Civil War, which ended in 1865. it gave them something to do, and secondly, it confined them to the Indians to specific areas. I want to talk for a moment about the Sand Creek Massacre. There was the U.S. Army Colonel John Shivington and 700 Colorado volunteers arrived at the Cheyenne camp in Colorado. The troops opened fire on the Indians, killing 200, most of them women and children, because the men were out hunting at that time. Now, Shivington is quoted as saying, "It is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. The Indians were seen as not only an enemy, but something completely undesirable. To remove them was the goal. They were in the way of, quote, progress, or is seen as being in the way." And people, this idea from Shivington was very typical at that time. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was an agreement between the United States and the Lakota Sioux Indian nations, and it guaranteed Indian ownership of the Black Hills region. But as we saw, when gold was discovered there after that treaty was thrown out. The discovery of gold in 1874 made the government want to take that land back, which they did. And that brings us, this conflict over gold in the Black Hills led to an event which brings two people are the stars of this event, Sitting Bull and George Armstrong Custer. Now, they would have a conflict in Montana in 1876, sparked by this fight over land that was first given to Native Americans and then taken back because of gold in South Dakota. This was the Battle of Little Bighorn. Custer leading the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry in pursuit of Sitting Bull and other Lakota Sioux. Custer's entire group was surrounded and wiped out. Little Bighorn is a river in eastern Montana, and it would, unfortunately for the Sioux, it would be their last real victory, military victory. But the timing of this was particularly important. This was in 1876, in the summer of 1876. At the exact same time, there was a centennial exhibition in Philadelphia. This was the 100-year anniversary of the United States forming of 1776. There was an entire year of celebrating American greatness, and when the news was received back east of this cavalry platoon of the entire 7th Cavalry being wiped out by Sitting Bull and other Lakota Sioux, it raised an enormous amount of anger in the American population. Now, layer to this, I want to talk about the hunting of the buffalo. See, in a lot of ways, the buffalo were the centerpiece for what was going on in the Great Plains. They were the food source, the clothing source, and the tool source for all of these Native Americans. They dominated the Great Plains. They ate the grass and they trampled whatever they got in contact with. And as we see here, there was up to 30 million bison on the Great Plains before 1850. Each of these big critters could weigh, the adult males could weigh up to 2,000 pounds and be 12 feet long. It was a strong belief that if we could get rid of buffalo, we could eliminate the Native Americans. By the 1870s, hundreds of thousands of buffalo hides were shipped eastward each year. More than 1.5 million were packed aboard trains and wagons in the winter of 1872 to 73 alone. Train companies offered tourists the chance to shoot buffalo from the windows of their coaches. Trains would roll along, they'd see a herd of bison in the distance. The train would stop. People would take out their rifles and shoot the buffalo, and the train would continue on. They'd leave the dead corpses to rot on the prairie. There were even buffalo killing contests. For example, a Kansas man set a record by killing 120 bison in just 40 minutes. Buffalo Bill Cody was hired to slaughter the animals. He killed reportedly more than 4,000 buffalo in just 2 years. This was not killed for the hide. This was not killed for the meat. This was not killed for any resource, but just to kill them. Some U.S. government officials even promoted the destruction of the bison herds as a way to defeat their Native American enemies because they were very much attached. The Indians needed the buffalo. Military commanders ordered their troops to kill buffalo not for food but to deny Native Americans of their own source of food. This would force the Native Americans to come to the American government for help. A congressman from Texas, James Throckmorton, said it would be a great step forward in the civilization of the Indians and the preservation of peace on the border if there was not a buffalo in existence. This was the government position in the late 1800s. Eliminate the American bison. This picture shows of buffalo bones being gathered from the prairie. This became an industry in the late 1800s. These bones would be ground up and there's phosphorus in that could be used as a cleaning agent. And as we learned before, by the 1880s, the huge buffalo herds were down to just a few hundred sheltered in the Yellowstone National Park. Well, when you are being pushed off your ancestral lands and your main source of food and clothing and weapons and shelter, the buffalo, are wiped out, you begin to feel rather hopeless. And that led to a new spirituality known as the ghost dance. And because many of the Sioux were very unhappy with life on the reservation. And so there was this prophet Wovoka, a Sioux, here he is, who had this vision. And he said if the Sioux would do a ghost dance, that he foresaw a time in which two things would happen. All of the buffalo would return, and all the white Americans would be gone. They would bring about then a traditional way of life to return to the Lakota Sioux. And then they added to this ghost shirts, and this is a picture of one here. Some Sioux living on the reservations who not only did the ghost dance would wear the ghost shirts, which they believed would stop bullets. The spread of the ghost dance, it made a lot of the settlers in the Great Plains and the Dakotas in particular very nervous. The military ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull, who had joined the movement. Now, remember, Sitting Bull is the one who, about 10 years before that, had wiped out Custer and his regiment. So the police surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin, a fight broke out, and Sitting Bull was killed. After Sitting Bull's death, many of the Sioux joined the ghost dance movement. But one Sioux leader, Bigfoot, pictured here, trying to avoid a conflict with the army, tried to get his group to a reservation. He felt like they couldn't defeat the U.S. Army, and he wanted to retreat to a reservation to be safe. They camped at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee is a creek in South Dakota. They were surrounded by 500 soldiers. Bigfoot and his followers were surrounded. Shooting began, at least 150 Sioux and 30 soldiers were killed. Most of the soldiers were killed from what is known as friendly fire. So there's a village that was kind of like down in there was this collection of teepees and dwellings from the 500 from the Bigfoot and his followers down in this little valley area, and they were surrounded up on a ridge, all at 360 degrees, by the soldiers. And the soldiers would fire in to the Indians in this little collection down in this little valley. But many of the shots, if they went high, would end up going across and hit the soldiers on the other side of the circle. Most of the Sioux who were killed were women, children, and old men. There were very few soldier casualties by Indians. Indians didn't kill the soldiers killed the soldiers. And most of the Sioux who were killed were women, children, and old men. Most of the Sioux were unarmed. The report of numbers of weapons found was in the single digits, a few. The weapons used by the soldiers were this known as Hotchkiss guns. They were like machine guns. They could fire an explosive shell every 6 seconds. This is what they were firing into this collection of old men, women, and children. This was in December of 1890. This is what the scene looked like after the shooting. These are the corpses of the Indians frozen. They had to dig a mass grave for the dead and bury them. At about the same time in the Southwest, Apache leader Geronimo was surrendered and sent to as a prisoner to Florida, from Arizona to Florida. And these two events, the capture of Geronimo and Wounded Knee, marked the end of armed resistance to the reservation system. In other words, Indians accepted their plight as having to live on reservations, where the policy of assimilation could be incorporated, where they could be forced to become like the rest of people in the United States. The Dawes Act required Indian lands to be surveyed. Each American Indian family was given 160 acres. Remaining land would be sold. Within 50 years from this, so by the 1930s, Indians would lose about 2/3 of their land. Not everyone thought this was the right thing to do. Helen Hunt Jackson, pictured here, wrote A Century of Dishonor, which criticized government treatment of American Indians. And I wanted to take just a moment to end here looking at what Native Americans, how their life is impacted today from the treatment of 120, 130 years ago. There's a picture of an Indian reservation today in Wyoming. Here's one in Arizona. Here's one in Montana. Here's one in Minnesota. Here's one in North Dakota. I want to give you some data to bring some conclusion to this. The poverty rate for all Americans is about 15%. The poverty rate for all Native Americans is about 25%, not quite double of the average American. Unemployment rate before COVID was typically at about 5.5%. Unemployment rate for all Native Americans was more than double that. According to the Center for Disease Control, Native Americans have an infant death rate, babies who die in the first year of life, 48% higher than the rest of the population. And compared to the rest of the American population, Native Americans are much more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, be unemployed, die in a motor vehicle accident, drop out of high school, have a teenage pregnancy, commit suicide. This is the legacy of the assimilation efforts of the late 1800s and our policy of the reservation system. It's important to look here if there is not for you to decide if there's causation or a correlation. Are these things related to the reservations but not caused by the reservation system, or are they caused by the reservation system? And that really is a matter for research and for you to explore more deeply. But this data is accurate. The information we have about we did force Native Americans onto reservations, and not every American Indian has abused drugs and is unemployed, and they not all have died in motor vehicle accidents, etc. But the rates are much higher than the general population.